This is the exact photo the Lawson family took, just hours before every single person in it, except one, was dead. The mother's lifeless body lies on the porch, and inside, every single one of her children has been executed. But what kind of father dresses his family in new clothes, poses them for a portrait, then annihilates them one by one before turning the gun on himself? This is the story of the Lawson family massacre, and before we dive into the darkness that consumed an entire bloodline in a single afternoon, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. It helps spread these stories so more people can hear them.
This was just unbelievable when this happened. I couldn't hardly take it in, because after being there and seeing this love that he showed toward his family, and then this tragedy occurred.
What makes this case so haunting isn't just the sheer brutality of what happened, or even the fact that it occurred on Christmas Day. It's the mystery that has consumed investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives for nearly a century since. Because even today, 95 years later, no one can definitively answer the question that echoes through the hollows of Stokes County. Why did Charlie Lawson do it? For starters, the warning signs were there, hidden in plain sight like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Just weeks before the massacre, the Lawson family had done something completely out of character for Depression-era tobacco farmers struggling to make ends meet. Charlie Lawson loaded up his wife Fanny and their 6 children and drove them into town to Daub's studio for a professional family portrait. This wasn't a wealthy family by any stretch of the imagination. Charlie was a tenant farmer, working land that belonged to someone else, scraping together whatever living he could from the unforgiving North Carolina soil. But something had motivated him to spend precious money that could have bought food or warm clothing for the approaching winter, on new outfits for everyone and capturing what would become their final photograph together. In this haunting image, 17-year-old Marie stands tall and proud in a new dress, her dark hair perfectly styled in the fashion of the day. Her eyes hold the quiet confidence of a young woman on the verge of adulthood, unaware that she had mere weeks left to live. 12-year-old Carrie grins beside her mother Fanny, who cradles 4-month-old Mary Lou in her arms with the tender care that only a mother can provide. 7-year-old Maybelle leans against her father's knee, seeking the protection and comfort that children instinctively expect from their parents. 4-year-old James and 2-year-old Raymond stand close together, their innocent faces bright with the wonder that Christmas always brings to children. Missing from the photograph was 19-year-old Arthur, Charlie's eldest son, who would soon become the sole survivor of what newspapers would call the most shocking crime in North Carolina history. Also absent from that perfect family tableau was the ghost that haunted the Lawson household. William, the son they had lost to illness 9 years earlier in 1920, whose death had cast a shadow over the family that never quite lifted. The man on the far left in the photo is believed to be a relative, but his identity remains unknown to this day. Now, the Lawson family had worked harder than most to build their modest life in the rolling hills of Stokes County. Charlie and Fanny had married in 1911, young and full of hope for the future they would build together. By 1918, they had established themselves as tenant tobacco farmers in the Germantown area, part of a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where neighbors helped neighbors, and where family was everything. They were known throughout the community as hard-working, church-going people who kept to themselves but were well regarded by everyone who knew them. Charlie was described as a quiet man, steady and reliable, the kind of person you could count on to keep his word and pay his debts. Fanny was remembered as a devoted mother who doted on her children, always putting their needs before her own. The family had even managed something that many of their neighbors could only dream of. In 1927, Charlie had scraped together enough money to purchase their farm on Brook Cove Road. This was no small achievement during a time when most families were struggling just to survive, when the economic hardships that would soon become the Great Depression were already beginning to squeeze rural communities across America. But what their neighbors didn't know, what no one could have suspected, was that behind Charlie's stoic exterior, something dark was taking root. Friends and family would later recall that Charlie had suffered a head injury sometime before the murders, struck by a falling tree branch while working in the woods. It was the kind of accident that happened all too often to men who made their living from the land. But this particular injury seemed to change something fundamental about Charlie Lawson. Yet when his brain was examined at Johns Hopkins Hospital after his death, doctors found no abnormalities, no tumors, no physical damage that could explain what was about to unfold. The injury that everyone remembered, the blow that seemed to alter Charlie's personality, left no trace that medical science of the day could detect. As Christmas Day, 1929, dawned bright and cold over their farm, there was no indication that this day would be anything other than a peaceful holiday celebration. Fanny had prepared a special Christmas cake, carefully placing raisins throughout the batter, a luxury that would later take on a macabre significance when curiosity seekers would invade their home, some reportedly taking pieces of that very cake as gruesome souvenirs. The children were excited about Christmas, as children always are. Marie, at 17, was probably thinking about her future, perhaps dreaming of marriage and a family of her own. Carrie, at 12, was still young enough to believe in the magic of Christmas morning. 7-year-old Maybelle would have been practically vibrating with anticipation. The little boys, James, Raymond, and baby Mary Lou, were simply happy to be surrounded by family, warm and safe in the home their parents had worked so hard to provide. But as Christmas afternoon approached, Charlie Lawson made a decision that would save his eldest son's life while sealing the fate of the rest of his family. He sent Arthur on an errand to the nearby town, telling him to go visit his uncle and aunt. It was an unusual request, sending one child away while keeping the others close on Christmas Day. But Arthur dutifully obeyed his father, unaware that he was walking away from the only family he had ever known. What happened next would shock a nation already reeling from the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. Because Charlie Lawson, the man who had carefully posed for that family portrait just weeks earlier, the father who had spent precious money on new clothes for his children, was about to systematically hunt down and murder his wife and 6 children with a methodical precision that suggested this was no crime of passion, no moment of temporary insanity. The first shots would ring out near the tobacco barn as 17-year-old Marie and 12-year-old Carrie were walking toward their relative's house for Christmas visits, their laughter echoing across the winter landscape for the very last time. Christmas afternoon silence sent both girls crashing to the frozen ground near the tobacco barn. 17-year-old Marie, who had been laughing with her younger sister just moments before, never had a chance to understand why her father had suddenly appeared with murder in his eyes. The girl who had posed so proudly in that family portrait just weeks earlier fell beside 12-year-old Carrie, whose final breath escaped in a cloud of winter vapor as Charlie Lawson stood over their bodies, methodically checking to ensure his deadly work was complete. But this was just the beginning of a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Because Charlie Lawson wasn't acting in a moment of rage or passion, every movement, every decision that followed showed the calculated precision of a man executing a plan he had been developing for weeks, possibly months. The same hands that had gently adjusted his daughter's poses for that Christmas portrait were now reloading his shotgun with mechanical efficiency. After confirming that Marie and Carrie were dead, Charlie turned and walked back toward the farmhouse where the rest of his family was enjoying their Christmas Day, completely unaware that death was approaching their front door with measured steps. The crunch of his boots on the frost-covered ground would have been the only sound breaking the terrible silence that had fallen over the Lawson farm. 37-year-old Fanny Lawson was probably in the kitchen, perhaps checking on her Christmas cake, or preparing something warm for the children to drink when they returned from their visit. She had spent 18 years married to Charlie, borne him 8 children, worked beside him through lean harvests and good ones alike. She trusted him completely, never imagining that the man she had pledged her life to was walking toward her with murder in his heart. When Fanny heard those familiar footsteps on the porch, she probably called out a greeting, maybe asked about the girls, or wondered why Charlie had returned so quickly. Did she notice something different in his expression when she appeared in the doorway? Did she have even a split second to realize that something was terribly wrong before Charlie raised his shotgun and fired point blank into the woman who had loved him unconditionally for nearly 2 decades? Inside the house, 4-year-old James and 2-year-old Raymond heard the gunshot that killed their mother. These little boys, still young enough to believe their father was their protector and provider, did what any terrified child would do when faced with incomprehensible violence. They ran and hid, their small hearts pounding with fear they couldn't understand. But there was nowhere in that modest farmhouse that could shield them from their father's murderous intent. Charlie moved through his own home like a predator stalking prey, searching methodically for his sons, while 7-year-old Maybelle cowered somewhere in the chaos, probably crying for her mother who would never answer again. The house that had once echoed with children's laughter and Fanny's gentle humming, now filled with the sound of overturned furniture, splintering wood, and the desperate whispered prayers of little boys who couldn't comprehend why Daddy was trying to hurt them. When Charlie found James cowering behind furniture, the 4-year-old probably reached out his arms, expecting comfort and protection from the man who had always been his hero. Instead, his father's shotgun ended his short life with brutal efficiency. 2-year-old Raymond, barely old enough to form complete sentences, was discovered in another hiding spot and met the same fate. 7-year-old Maybelle, who had leaned so trustingly against her father's knee in that family portrait, was also hunted down and killed with the same methodical precision. But perhaps the most heartbreaking murder was yet to come. 4-month-old Mary Lou, the baby who had slept peacefully in her mother's arms for that final family photograph, couldn't run or hide or even cry out for help. She couldn't understand the horror unfolding around her or plead for mercy from the father who was supposed to protect her above all else. According to investigators who would later examine the crime scene, Charlie Lawson killed his infant daughter not with the shotgun that had claimed the lives of his other children, but with blunt force trauma, bludgeoning a helpless baby to death with his bare hands or a heavy object. The medical examiner would struggle to find words to describe the brutality inflicted on someone so small and innocent. However, what came next reveals the twisted psychology of a man completely detached from reality and human emotion. After murdering his wife and 6 children, Charlie Lawson spent precious time arranging their bodies in a grotesque display of what he apparently believed was dignity and respect. He crossed each victim's arms over their chest and placed rocks under their heads, as if preparing them for some macabre funeral service that only he could comprehend. The meticulous nature of this post-mortem staging wasn't the behavior of someone who had snapped in a moment of fury or temporarily lost control of his faculties. This was the work of a man following some internal script that made sense only to him, a twisted ritual that suggested he saw himself not as murderer, but as someone carrying out some necessary, even merciful act. Meanwhile, Arthur Lawson was making his way back from his uncle's house, probably looking forward to rejoining his family for Christmas dinner and whatever modest gifts they might have exchanged. The 19-year-old had no way of knowing that in the span of a few hours he had gone from being the eldest son in a family of 8 to being completely and utterly alone in the world. As Arthur approached the farm on Brook Cove Road, he might have noticed the unusual silence. No sounds of children playing, no warm light spilling from the windows, no smoke rising from the chimney where Fanny should have been cooking their holiday meal. The farmhouse that should have been bustling with Christmas activity stood eerily quiet against the winter landscape. When Arthur entered the house and discovered the carnage that had been his family, his screams of anguish shattered the winter air and would haunt him for the rest of his tragically shortened life. The young man who had awakened that morning as the beloved eldest son of a large, happy family now found himself walking through a slaughterhouse, stepping over the mutilated bodies of everyone he had ever loved. Neighbors who heard Arthur's cries of horror came running from their own Christmas celebrations, and soon word spread through the rural community that something unspeakable had happened at the Lawson farm. Men grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Women gathered their children close, and everyone wondered the same terrifying question: was the killer still out there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from today. And if this case hits you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's next. As the crowd of horrified neighbors gathered outside the blood-soaked farmhouse, they could hear something that made their blood run cold: footsteps in the nearby woods. Charlie Lawson was still alive, still moving through the trees that surrounded his property, and no one knew whether his killing spree was truly over or if he might emerge from those woods to claim even more victims. Then, cutting through the whispered prayers and muffled sobs of the gathering crowd, came the sound everyone had been both dreading and hoping for: one final gunshot from deep in the woods, ending the most horrific Christmas day in North Carolina history and beginning a mystery that would consume investigators and amateur sleuths for nearly a century. Deep in the woods behind the Lawson farmhouse, investigators found Charlie Lawson's body slumped against a tree. The same 12-gauge shotgun that had destroyed his family now turned on himself. But the scene they discovered raised more questions than it answered, because the evidence suggested that Charlie hadn't simply walked into the woods and immediately ended his life in a moment of remorse or panic. The footprints in the snow told a chilling story that would haunt investigators for decades. Charlie had walked in circles around that tree, around and around and around, for what experts estimated must have been at least 30 minutes. 30 minutes of pacing while his neighbors discovered the carnage he had left behind. 30 minutes to hear Arthur's screams of anguish echoing through the winter air. 30 minutes to change his mind, walk back to that farmhouse, and surrender himself to face whatever justice awaited him. But Charlie Lawson chose death over answers, taking with him the one thing everyone desperately needed: the truth about why he had slaughtered his entire family on the holiest day of the Christian calendar. Near his body, investigators found 2 letters addressed to his parents, documents that might have contained the explanation that could make sense of the senseless. But to this day, the contents of those letters remain unknown, either destroyed by authorities who deemed them too disturbing for public consumption, or simply lost to the chaos and confusion of the investigation that followed. Whatever Charlie Lawson wrote in his final moments, whatever explanation or justification he might have offered for murdering his wife and 6 innocent children, died with him in those cold North Carolina woods, leaving behind only questions that would torment his surviving son and the broader community for generations. The autopsy performed on Charlie's brain at Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country, revealed no tumors, no obvious abnormalities, no medical explanation for the massacre that had shocked the nation. The head injury that friends and family remembered so clearly, the tree branch that had struck him while working and seemed to change his personality, left no detectable damage that the medical science of 1929 could identify. The pathologist who examined Charlie's brain tissue would later tell investigators that he had never seen a case where such extreme violence could be committed by someone with no apparent neurological damage. It was as if Charlie Lawson had simply chosen evil over good, darkness over light, with no underlying medical condition to explain his descent into homicidal madness. For 60 years, the Lawson family murders remained a local tragedy without a clear motive, a horrific crime that defied explanation and haunted the people of Stokes County like an open wound that refused to heal. Newspapers had called Charlie a well-to-do farmer who had gone mad, but no journalist, no detective, no expert could provide a satisfactory answer to the question that consumed everyone. Why? Then, in 1990, researcher Trudy J. Smith published a book that sent shockwaves through the community and sparked debates that continue to rage to this day. Smith claimed that her interviews with elderly residents had uncovered a dark family secret, that Charlie Lawson had been sexually abusing his eldest daughter, and that the teenager had become pregnant with her father's child. According to this explosive theory, Charlie's decision to murder his family was motivated by shame and desperation to hide his crimes from a community that would have ostracized and possibly lynched him if the truth had come to light. The family portrait, the new clothes, the Christmas timing, all of it supposedly part of Charlie's twisted attempt to create one final perfect memory before destroying the evidence of his abuse and the daughter who could expose him. The incest theory gained traction among amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who were hungry for any explanation that could make sense of the senseless. It provided a motive that felt proportional to the crime, a secret so devastating that a man might kill his entire family rather than face exposure and punishment. But here's the fundamental problem with this theory that its proponents refuse to acknowledge. It's based entirely on rumors, gossip, and secondhand accounts collected 60 years after the murders occurred. No physical evidence supports the incest allegation. No medical examiner in 1929 reported finding a pregnant victim among the bodies. No contemporary newspaper accounts, police reports, or witness statements mention anything about inappropriate behavior between Charlie and Marie. The reality is that Trudy Smith's allegations are built on the shaky foundation of elderly people's memories of things they heard other people say decades earlier, the worst kind of evidence that any legitimate investigation would immediately dismiss as unreliable hearsay. The truth is that we may never know why Charlie Lawson committed this unspeakable act, and perhaps that's the most terrifying aspect of this case. We want there to be a reason, a logical explanation that makes sense of the horror, because the alternative, that ordinary fathers and husbands can simply choose to become monsters without warning or cause, is too frightening for most people to accept. What we do know is the devastating impact this single day had on everyone who survived its aftermath. Arthur Lawson, the sole survivor who had been sent away and thus escaped death, carried an unimaginable burden for the rest of his tragically shortened life. He had lost his entire immediate family in a matter of hours, murdered by the father he had trusted and respected, and he spent the remaining years of his life struggling to comprehend how such evil could exist in someone he thought he knew. Arthur tried desperately to rebuild his life from the ashes of that Christmas Day horror, but the trauma followed him like a shadow wherever he went. In 1945, just 16 years after the massacre, Arthur Lawson died in an automobile accident that many whispered wasn't really an accident at all, that the sole survivor of the Lawson family massacre had finally succumbed to the weight of his grief, guilt, and the impossible burden of being the only one left to remember his family as they truly were. Meanwhile, the Lawson farmhouse became something that would have horrified the memory of the victims if they could have known, a macabre tourist attraction that turned their final resting place into a carnival sideshow. Charlie's brother Marion opened the blood-stained home to curiosity seekers, charging admission for people to walk through the rooms where an entire family had been slaughtered. Visitors reportedly took souvenirs from the crime scene, pieces of Fanny's Christmas cake, raisins that had been embedded in the batter she had so lovingly prepared for her family's final holiday meal. The cake that should have been a symbol of a mother's love and Christmas joy became instead a grotesque collector's item for people who seemed to have forgotten that real human beings had died in that house. The case captured the American imagination in ways that few crimes ever have, spawning murder ballads, folk songs, and eventually podcasts, television shows, and Netflix documentaries. Each generation has discovered anew the horrifying mystery of what drove a father to destroy his own bloodline, but none have come closer to answering the fundamental question that Charlie Lawson took to his grave. Today, 95 years after that terrible Christmas day, you can visit Madison Dry Goods and Country Store, the building where the Lawson family's bodies were embalmed after the murders. The location has embraced its dark history, becoming part museum, part memorial to the victims, a more dignified remembrance than the ghoulish tourist attraction that once exploited their tragedy. But the Lawson massacre wasn't an isolated incident in these ancient mountains. Just decades later, another family would face unimaginable horror on a remote Tennessee highway, when strangers would shatter the lives of the Lillelid family in an act of senseless violence that shocked the nation. Here's that story.
They weren't shot all at once. Members of the family saw other members of the family being killed.
They say troubled minds often dwell in the youth, but nothing could prepare anyone for the twisted actions of these 6 young individuals. What started as a carjacking quickly turned into a horrifying massacre, leaving an entire family brutally murdered, except for the youngest member, the sole survivor. This is the story of the Lillelid murders, a case so shocking it would forever be etched in history as one of the most brutal crimes the police have ever faced. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this case remains unforgettable. Almost 28 years ago, in 1997, the Lillelid family became victims of a tragic murder over a seemingly small reason, all starting when the father shared his faith with a group of troubled teenagers. Now, They were the kind of family you'd want as neighbors, hardworking, loving, and deeply rooted in their beliefs. The father, Vidar, was born in Bergen, Norway, in May 1962, the youngest of 4 siblings. In his 20s, he moved to Florida, where he met the vibrant Delfina, who hailed from New Jersey and was born in March 1969. The two tied the knot in February 1989 in sunny Miami, Florida, and soon welcomed their first child, a beautiful daughter named Tabitha. With a growing family, the Lillelid sought a peaceful sanctuary away from the chaos of city life. They found their dream home in Knoxville, Tennessee, where they could nurture their children in a safe environment. By 1995, their son Peter arrived, bringing even more joy to the family. By the end of 1996, they had left their apartment behind and settled into a charming 50-year-old house in the Powell community, planning to renovate an annex for Delfina's mother. Vidar worked as a bellman at the Holiday Inn Cedar Bluff in West Knoxville, while Delfina dedicated her time to homeschooling their children. As devout Jehovah's Witnesses, their faith was the cornerstone of their lives. On the 6th of April in 1997, the Lillelid family attended a religious convention at Freedom Hall in Johnson City, about 100 miles from their home. The day was filled with hope and community spirit, and after the convention, they began their journey back home in their reliable 1987 Dodge minivan. As they traveled south on Interstate 81, a sudden pit stop would lead them to a fate they never could have imagined. Around 7:20 p.m., they stopped at a rest area, a seemingly innocent pause in their journey. 2-year-old Peter, restless and suffering from an earache, needed some attention, so Vidar decided to take him for a walk. Meanwhile, Delfina and Tabitha headed to the restrooms. On the way there, Delfina had a quick chat with a friend, Karen Sinclair, and her teenage daughter, who were also returning from the same convention. As Vidar and Peter waited by the visitor center, 2 young girls emerged, and Vidar, ever friendly, smiled and asked them if they believed in God. To his surprise, they replied that they did not. Just then, 2 young men joined the scene. When Vidar offered to share more about his faith, one of the men responded with interest. This encounter marked the beginning of a chilling turn of events. The 2 young men, 20-year-old Joseph Reisner and 14-year-old Jason Bryant, had an unsettling agenda. Alongside them were 2 young women, 18-year-old Natasha Cornett and 17-year-old Karen Howell. As Vidar began to explain the basics of the Jehovah's Witness faith, Delfina and Tabitha soon joined them. But out of nowhere, Joseph returned from his car where 2 other friends, 19-year-old Edward Mullins and 18-year-old Crystal Sturgill, were waiting. In a shocking twist, he pulled out a 9mm gun and declared, "I'm sorry about this, everybody. Just be quiet, and nothing's going to happen to you. All we need is the van." Now, if you're wondering why these troubled teens needed a car when Joseph already had his own vehicle, well, it's all because of desperation. Joseph's blue Chevrolet Citation was barely running and wouldn't last much longer. He had just received a speeding ticket, adding to his anxiety about getting caught. On top of that, they were in a tight spot financially. Joseph and his friends had stolen 2 guns and some cash before leaving their hometown of Betsy Lane in Kentucky. Desperation hung in the air. They needed a reliable getaway vehicle, and they were running out of time before their families or the police could catch up with them. So, with the gun in hand, Joseph ordered the family to return to their minivan. Vidar, hoping to defuse the situation, offered to give the group his wallet and keys, but they refused. The Lillelid family was forced into the van alongside Joseph, Natasha, Karen, and Jason. Vidar was made to drive, and as they pulled out of the rest area, Edward and Crystal followed them in Joseph's car. Now, these young individuals were far from innocent. Each member of this troubled group carried a heavy burden of a dark past. Broken homes, academic failures, and experiences of emotional and sexual abuse marked their lives. Substance abuse, including drugs and alcohol, was a common thread that connected their stories. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. In fact, just 2 days before their encounter with the Lillelid family, they had stayed at the Collie Motel on US 23 in Pikeville, Kentucky. It was there that they took part in disturbing activities, even going so far as to burn 666 into the carpet as part of their twisted games. Engaging in seances and satanic rituals, they showcased just how deeply they had descended into darkness. It was believed that the sinister plans of this troubled group began to take shape after their stay at the motel. Following that unsettling time, they returned to Natasha's trailer, where they shared chilling news with her mother, Madonna Wallen. They announced their intention to start Armageddon, with Karen ominously declaring that the end of time was coming on Sunday, April 6th of that year.
Think they could start the Armageddon. I know a lot of people don't believe in demons and the powers of the dark, but they're very real.
On that fateful day, the group took a dangerous step further. They devised a plan that would lead them to the home of a local police officer. Jason created a disturbance outside, drawing the officer's attention, while the others snuck inside. In their reckless pursuit, they managed to seize 2 guns, 2 boxes of ammunition, and around $500. Now, Natasha, in particular, was just as troubled as the others in the group. Desperate to escape the harsh reality of her life, she claimed to have been in contact with angels and demons since she was only 4 years old. This early exposure to such dark and mystical ideas fueled her growing fascination with witchcraft. Over time, her obsession became so intense that she began referring to herself as Satan's daughter. This unsettling identity was accompanied by violent tendencies. She even threatened her own mother with a knife, a stark indication of how deeply disturbed she had become. However, she would also share in court how her mother had physically abused her at such a young age.
I remember when she was fixing my hair before daycare, she would get real upset and she'd start pulling it out and dragging me by the hair of the head, and sometimes she'd hit me in the head with a brush and stuff like that, and throw brushes and stuff at me.
Wow, what had you done?
I don't know. I mean, she said that I sassed her, but I don't remember doing it. She'd hit me with her fist, or she'd grab whatever was near her and hit me with that.
But her friends were all too familiar with Natasha's obsession with violence. She often talked about her desire to live out the chaotic storyline of her favorite movie, Natural Born Killers. This film, infamous for its exploration of madness and bloodshed, struck a chord with her, serving as both inspiration and justification for her darker impulses. Moreover, Natasha's reckless lifestyle mirrored the intensity of her beliefs. From a young age, she had been drinking alcohol and experimenting with a range of illegal drugs, including heroin, ecstasy, and cocaine. Apart from that fact, Natasha was extremely close to Karen, who also grew up in a violent household. Karen claimed that she was allegedly sexually assaulted between the ages of 5 and 10 by both her uncle and cousin. But just like Natasha, she also had a fascination with the occult and witchcraft, and she regularly used illegal substances.
Did you first begin with the Ouija board?
Yes.
And after the Ouija board, you got into automatic writing?
Yes.
Now, so His Honor can understand, automatic writing is when you call upon spirits to enter you.
No.
Spirits do enter you in automatic writing, don't they?
Yes, but you don't have to call upon them to get them to come into you.
Now, interestingly, Joseph, the oldest member of the group, had always been known as a good student. However, everything changed after his mother and stepfather divorced. The split deeply affected him, pushing him into a world of drinking and drug use. Initially, he had been dating Natasha, but as things shifted, he found himself in a relationship with Karen. Meanwhile, Natasha was involved with another group member, Edward. Edward seemed to have the most stable life among them. He was focused on earning his general educational diploma and worked at a grocery store, showcasing a sense of responsibility that others in the group lacked. But once he started dating Natasha, everything began to change. Additionally, Jason, the youngest of the group, was already on probation. Despite his young age, he had a troubling history of drug and alcohol abuse. With an IQ of around 85, his emotional and social skills were significantly underdeveloped, making it hard for him to connect with others. In a bizarre attempt to prove his toughness and earn respect from the group, he even allowed Natasha to carve her initials into his arm. Crystal, a relatively new member of the group, had her own struggles. While she did well in school, she faced emotional neglect at home. In December 1996, everything took a darker turn when she accused her stepfather of sexual abuse. This brave move led to her being thrown out of her house, leaving her homeless. For the next few months, she bounced around, staying with various people, including Natasha, who took her in during this tumultuous time. At this point, it's pretty clear that these young teens were really lost and had been through a lot of tough stuff. But that doesn't make their actions any better. They still murdered others. Going back to the night of the attack when the teens abducted the family, Delphina did her best to keep her kids calm by singing. But her sweet attempts were met with frustration when Jason snapped at her to shut up. But in the middle of all this chaos, young Tabitha, with her innocent heart, tried to lighten the mood by offering Karen one of her chocolates. And just before 9 p.m. that night, 2 calls buzzed into 911 reporting gunshots on Payne Hollow Lane in Greenville. One neighbor claimed they heard the shots and noticed 2 cars pull up, but only one drove away. The second caller, a contractor working on a nearby water tower, reported hearing 2 quick bursts of gunfire, followed by a chaotic noise that reminded him of kids playing on a playground. Deputy Jeff Morgan and his supervisor rolled in around 9 p.m. They first spotted the headlights of a blue Chevrolet Citation, oddly angled on the road. It looked abandoned, stuck on a stump in the muddy ground. The car was empty and its license plate was missing. But what they discovered next to the car would haunt them forever. In a ditch nearby, they found 4 bodies, a man and a woman, with a young boy and girl resting on top of them. 6-year-old Tabitha was draped over her father, Vidar, while 2-year-old Peter was lying on his mother, Delphina. Tragically, all 4 had been shot, and Vidar and Delphina's legs were crushed, marked by tire tracks. As the police dug deeper into the investigation, little Tabitha made a slight movement, prompting officers to rush her to the hospital. Doctors at the University of Tennessee Medical Center in Knoxville worked tirelessly throughout the night to save her, but sadly, she was pronounced dead the following day. Meanwhile, Peter lay across his mother's body, his face buried in the mud. When Deputy Jeff Morgan turned him over, Peter let out a heartbreaking cry. The deputy quickly sat down and held him close until the ambulance arrived. Peter was also rushed to the hospital. Fortunately, he survived, but not without significant injuries. He suffered severe spinal damage and lost an eye. Doctors feared he could have suffocated if he had been left in the mud any longer. During the autopsy, they determined that the family had been lined up along the ditch and shot one after another. It's believed that Vidar was killed first. He was shot in the right eye, an injury that would have knocked him out instantly. While lying in the ditch, he was shot 4 more times. Delphina was initially shot in her left arm and then in her left leg. Neither wound was fatal. However, she was shot 6 more times, and it's believed she was still alive during the horrifying attacks on her children and when she was run over by the minivan. Tabitha suffered a single gunshot wound to the head, while Peter was shot twice. The first bullet entered behind his right ear and exited through his right eye, and the second bullet struck him in the back as he tried to escape. The Chevrolet Citation had gotten wedged on a tree stump, so the 6 attackers jumped into a minivan, driving over Vidar and Delfina as they sped away. Even though the license plates from the Citation were removed, authorities were able to trace the owner through the vehicle identification number. It led them to Joseph's mother, Mary. She informed the police that she hadn't seen her son in 2 days and didn't know where he was. However, she did know who he was with and provided the police with the names of the other 5 members of the group, all of whom were also missing. The police now had a clear idea of who they were searching for and the vehicle they were traveling in. As the group made their way through Georgia, they decided to stop at a Waffle House for a bite to eat. However, they didn't stay long. When a group of police officers entered the restaurant, the group quickly left, clearly on edge. They had originally planned to head to New Orleans, but instead, they changed their route and aimed for Mexico. Upon reaching the border, they encountered trouble. They were denied entry because they didn't have the right identification. After some effort, they managed to find a way into the country. However, things took a turn when Jason Bryant was shot in the hand and leg during their time in Mexico. The group was eventually stopped by Mexican police, who, upon hearing their claims of being lost, ordered them out of the van for a search. During this search, officers discovered a knife and a photo album that belonged to the Lillelid family. After being ordered to return to the United States, they crossed back over the border, where American Border Patrol officers conducted another search. It was here that they were arrested and taken to a jail in Arizona. Shockingly, just 2 days after the murders, several of the suspects still had personal items belonging to the Lillelid family in their possession. Natasha had a piece of Vidar's belt and a picture of Tabitha tucked away in her purse. Karen was found with a Hello Kitty diary lock that belonged to Tabitha, and Crystal had the key ring from the Lillelid family home. None of these items were of any real value, suggesting they were trophies from their gruesome crimes. At that time, the district attorney sought media attention to extradite the group back to Tennessee to face trial, making it clear that he would pursue the death penalty for the 4 adults involved. The juveniles, Karen and Jason, were looking at potential life sentences without the possibility of parole. The outrage over the senseless and random killings was palpable in Knox County. One convenience store owner hung 6 nooses on a scaffold in front of his business, stating that while he was against lynching, he supported capital punishment. A crowd gathered, chanting, "Burn in hell," as the 4 adults were escorted by deputies back to Greene County Criminal Court. The judge denied repeated defense requests to try the 6 defendants separately, but ruled that finding a fair jury in Greene County would be impossible. Instead, a jury would be brought in from Bradley County, about 150 miles away. The trial date was set for March 1998. However, it never took place. In February of that year, all 6 defendants pleaded guilty to charges of murder and attempted murder as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty.
I don't think I have any choice in the case, as far as you're concerned, Ms. Cornett, but to sentence you in each of counts 18, 19, and 20 to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
The actual truth of who fired the fatal shots and what role each person played remained unclear. Each of the 6 defendants tells a different story about what happened when they arrived at Payne Hollow Lane, and those close to the case struggle to fully believe any one version of events. Natasha, Karen, and Joseph all maintain that it was 14-year-old Jason who was the sole shooter. They claim that once they exited the van, there was an argument over what to do with the family, at which point Jason started shooting. However, many people believe that the idea of a single shooter doesn't align with the forensic evidence. Some think there were at least 2 shooters using 2 different guns. Jason insists that the other 3 made up their stories when they realized he wouldn't be facing the death penalty and might get a lighter sentence due to his age. He claims that it was Joseph and Edward who fired the weapons that night. Most accounts agree that Crystal, who has always insisted she did not hurt anyone, did not leave the car during the shootings. Regardless of their differing stories, all 6 were handed the same sentence: 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional consecutive 25-year sentence for Peter's attempted murder. Appeals were filed for Karen Howell and Jason Bryant due to a later U.S. Supreme Court decision that restricts the imposition of life sentences on juveniles. However, these appeals have been denied, and all 6 defendants still remain in prison in Tennessee. As for 2-year-old Peter, who fortunately survived the attack, his life took a significant turn following the tragic events. After his medical condition stabilized at the end of April 1997, a custody battle ensued between his maternal grandmother, Lydia Celaya, residing in Miami, Florida, and his paternal aunt, Randy Heyer, living in Sweden. The deciding factor in the case was Heyer's commitment to raising Peter in the faith and teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses. On July 1, 1997, local judge Fred McDonald awarded custody to Heyer. Peter was raised in the Stockholm area by Heyer and her family. By 2007, when he was about 12 years old, he was still experiencing difficulty walking due to the injuries sustained during the attack. However, by 2017, Peter had completed his IT education and was actively seeking employment. In 2019, he made the decision to move back to the United States to pursue a career in technology. He married in 2020, and he and his wife Caitlin now reside in Connecticut.
Frankly, few people have the courage or motivation, I should say, to ask why. But of course, that's what puts me apart from most other people, my story that is.
In a related note, on August 24, 2001, one of the defendants, Cornett, and death row inmate Krista Pike were allegedly involved in an attack on a fellow prisoner, Patricia Jones. They nearly strangled Jones to death using a shoelace after Pike and Jones were placed in a holding cell with Cornett during a fire alarm. Although the Department of Corrections suspected Cornett's involvement, investigators found insufficient evidence to charge her with aiding Pike, who was subsequently convicted of attempted murder. The district attorney at the time claimed in several interviews that the 6 youths had planned a killing spree inspired by the popular film Natural Born Killers. However, this theory is highly disputed given that the violent acts began and ended with the Lillelid family at Payne Hollow Road. The district attorney also stated that the bodies were arranged in the shape of a cross, a claim that Sheriff David Davenport, who investigated the scene, refuted. According to Davenport, the teens were simply trying to escape the situation and did not attempt to arrange the bodies in any particular way. But honestly, one can only hope those teens face some serious consequences for what they did. The community hasn't forgotten this case. It still resonates deeply with many. Fast forward 25 years, and a small gathering took place to remember the Lillelid family at the exact same spot where they were last found. One of the gatherers present during that time, Waddell, along with his partner Jeff Morgan, were the first Greene County Sheriff's Department patrolmen on the scene on April 6, 1997. They thought they were responding to a disturbance call involving drunks shooting guns on Payne Hollow, but what they found has haunted them ever since.
I can still see them laying there. Yeah, it never leaves. It's just something you got to deal with.
And it's true. The Lillelid family did no harm to anyone and lived as normal people who simply wanted to share their faith. Yet they were met with a gruesome murder. Fortunately, Peter has no memory of that horrific night and what the 6 did to him and his family. Even a journalist once said, "April 6th never fails to remind me of the horrific tragedy that befell the Lillelid family, all because of a chance stop at an interstate rest stop." In my almost 8 years as a print journalist, this is the story that moved me to tears. So, if you were Peter and had forgotten everything about that night, would you be able to forgive the killers who took away your family? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you enjoy the way we create these videos and want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.